Welcome inside the War Room. I'm your host, Andrew Valancourt, and we're back today for episode 42 of the Dynasty War Room podcast. On today's show, we're going to break down some Week 16 starts of the week. So we're on to the semifinal round of the fantasy football playoffs, and so I have a few players picked out at each position that I think are worthy starts this week, players that I think can be top 5 at the position that can really help you out, make a difference in your lineup. Last week, not so great. Had some hits, had some misses. It was kind of one of those things where really around the league, there were a few players that really, exploded and had huge games, and then there were just a lot of busts, including a lot of very fantasy relevant players that did not, live up to their typical performance that we've seen throughout the season. So hopefully we can get back on track today and, get you some good matchups here for your semifinal games. So before we jump into that, as always, make sure you are following this show on whatever platform you're currently listening to us on. Follow us on Spotify, Apple, whichever platform, we are there. YouTube, you can subscribe there. And then we're on Twitter, social media, at Dynasty War Room. And we're on Facebook as well. You can go like that page. We just post, show updates on the Facebook page, but Twitter, we're much more active, and you can interact with us there, ask questions, show ideas as we approach the off season. So with all that being said, let's jump right into the quarterbacks for the starts of the week. And just like last week, I'm going to do 4 players at each position, with the exception of tight end. I only got 3 names this week, but to make up for it, I added a 5th wide receiver. And at least one of these names at each position is going to be fairly obvious. A big-time player that almost certainly would be started regardless of situation. But I included them this week because not only are they, just typically good starts, I think this week in particular they have, number 1 overall at their position upside and players that should really help you this week. So I have those players included, and then I have 3 other names that are, a little bit less obvious. Many of them still players that you would be starting, but not all. And, given that we are moving on to week 16, and, you're probably not having to dig too far down your bench anymore. Chances are, if you're a team that has advanced to this stage of the playoffs, you have a good lineup, good players. And so these are some, different options that, you probably have started a lot of points throughout the season, but maybe not necessarily every single week. So I tried to have a bit of some variation here. So I'm not just giving you, all super obvious picks, but not, going too far down the bottom of the barrel. Because again, like last week where I think we maybe went a little bit too far down, it can result in a bit more variance. So with all that being said, let's start with the quarterback position. And Jalen Hurts, Eagles quarterback, he's the first name on this list, and he takes on the Washington Commanders, a division game. They're on the road at Washington, and this is a situation where, not only is Jalen Hurts playing very well, but this is a big game for, the division, for the playoff race. The Eagles are right there with Detroit and now Minnesota for the 1 seed. So they're pushing to, get home field advantage in the playoffs, but also to still win their own division. Now, they should have that, safely in the bag. However, anything can happen. There's a few games left. Obviously, if they were to lose this game, that would open up the door a bit for some chaos. However, I think the Eagles are, a little bit more focused on the 1 seed, given that, Detroit has had so many injuries and Philly has been playing so well. So this is one of those situations where divisional games tend to be very competitive, not all the time, as we saw, the other night with Chicago and Minnesota. But generally speaking, I think these games are a little bit more tightly contested. These 2 teams in particular probably headed for a high-scoring affair. And Jalen Hurts is somebody that, you love having in your roster, right in that, QB1 spot in a Superflex league. But obviously you're starting him in all 1 quarterback leagues as well, unless somehow you also have Josh Allen. But Jalen Hurts, slam dunk start. I'm expecting big things, and I expect him to be, in the top 3 at his position come next week. Now, next up on the list is Baker Mayfield, who Tampa Bay Bucs quarterback. He's coming off a very good week himself, and he goes on the road to take on the Dallas Cowboys. That's a situation where you're indoors in a dome against, mediocre defense. Should be a situation where, there's probably going to be a lot of points, and that's really one of the things that you're looking for, right? Kind of a high scoring situation. So Tampa, I think to the surprise of most people, put up a boatload of points on the Chargers. I was not expecting that. In fact, Justin Herbert was a start of the week at QB last week because of Tampa Bay's defense, and we had seen, what some players had done against them throughout the season, and that narrative basically flipped. It was actually Baker Mayfield and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that scored a whole bunch of points on LA. So I think that Tampa should win this game, but I think that Dallas has shown enough on offense that it's not just going to be something where, it's 24-0 at halftime and they just start running the ball. I think you're going to get a pretty good, heavy dose of Mike Evans in this game. I think he's somebody that you're obviously going to have in your lineup that helped you out a ton this past week if you had him in your lineup. So Baker Mayfield, nice matchup here against Dallas. He's the second quarterback on this list. All right. Bo Nix, Denver Broncos quarterback, is next up on this list, and he had a bit of a rough showing in Week 15. I know I started him in a league, and I won in spite of him, not because of him, and he threw a bunch of interceptions, and he's got the Chargers on the road this week. Big divisional game, Thursday Night Football, huge matchup for the playoff picture in the AFC, and he's going to have to play better. This is a situation where we just saw what Baker Mayfield did to this defense, and this is an opportunity for Bo Nix to right the ship, get things together. He's had a rough couple games now in a row, so this is kind of your bounce back pick. He does have some rushing upside. He's got a nice little rushing floor, and so I'm expecting a bounce back here. I think that Bo Nix can be somebody that you can comfortably start as a high-end QB2 in Superflex. And last but not least at quarterback, I'm going back to the well with Caleb Williams, who was disappointing last week. I really thought that he had an opportunity to take advantage of a Minnesota secondary in a situation where they'd be playing from behind and trying to come back. And they did end up in that situation, but he did not take advantage. He didn't look very good. And so this is a pick that makes me a little bit nervous. I don't love Caleb Williams in this matchup, but I do like it. And, if I was somebody looking for a middle tier QB2, I think Caleb Williams is somebody that you can start. I almost put Aaron Rodgers on this list. He plays the Rams. I think that is somebody that I would, consider in this spot as well. Probably a similar sort of tier. In fact, you can probably include Bo Nix in that tier as well, but I think I like Nix at the top of that group. But Caleb Williams, who has had some really big fantasy football performances throughout the season, he's got an opportunity against the Detroit defense that is absolutely gutted. They've lost almost every single starter on defense from the beginning of the year. There's only a handful of players left. Both safeties, Terry and Arnold at corner, Reeder at defensive tackle, and I believe every single other player. Oh, and Jack Campbell. So somebody will correct me next week if I'm wrong, but I think that makes 7 out of the 11 starters on defense are out for the Lions from the start of the season. So it's a rough situation there. And we saw what Buffalo did last week. And I think that the Bears have an opportunity here to put up some points. I think Detroit should win this game. They should come out very motivated. Their offense certainly is, still working well and putting up points as we saw against Buffalo. But the Bears defense and, this team overall is just not the same type of team as the Bills. So I do expect Detroit to win, but Caleb Williams should be able to move the ball a bit better than he did against Minnesota and put up some points on his own, especially in the second half, garbage time. We saw Jared Goff rack up a ton of points in the fourth quarter of that game last week, and I kind of expect something similar here, just maybe to a bit of a lesser extent. But I think you can get, a performance in the low 20s in terms of fantasy points, and I think that would be reasonable to expect. Running backs. Let's start things off with our more obvious pick, and that's going to be Jahmyr Gibbs, who, if you've listened to any other shows this week or you just followed along with, fantasy football content on social media, Jahmyr Gibbs, I think everyone is expecting him to just absolutely dominate. I mean, this is a player that was, a top tier, number one, top 5 running back in fantasy as it is, while David Montgomery, who's a RB1 of his own, was healthy. Montgomery is now out for the season, so Jahmyr Gibbs is going to get this entire backfield to himself. I would fully expect him to be getting 20 carries, 5+ targets. I mean, this is somebody that he should be touching the ball 25 times a game, essentially, as we get through the end of the season. And that's going to result in a ton of fantasy points. I mean, I think we're talking, you could take off Jahmyr Gibbs and just replace it with Christian McCaffrey, fully healthy Christian McCaffrey. And I think that's the type of production that you should be, looking for and expecting out of Jahmyr Gibbs over these next few weeks. Now, the matchups are only so-so. This week, though, he's on the road at Chicago, as we've discussed, and you can run the ball on Chicago. I think this is a situation where Detroit can get up in the game and then focus on running the ball, and it's going to be all Jahmyr Gibbs. I mean, they'll sprinkle in a little bit of Craig Reynolds, later in the game if things get out of hand, but Jahmyr Gibbs is somebody that you should be thrilled about having in your starting lineup, and I think will absolutely be in the conversation for number 1 overall running back on the week. Now, the running back that was the number 1 running back of the week in week 15, I believe, was James Conner, depending on your league's scoring format. And he had 30 fantasy points last week in PPR leagues. And I think he's going to be great again this week. James Conner goes on the road to the Carolina Panthers, and that's a team that you can run the ball on all year long. Carolina has given up a lot of yards, a lot of points on the ground to fantasy running backs. So I think James Conner is in a situation where he can do that again. He's going to dominate the Arizona backfield. Another team that is right on the cusp of the playoffs, fighting for a playoff spot in the NFC West. So James Conner, I think, is an absolute slam dunk. Again, I'm starting him everywhere that I have him. I have been very pleased with the fact that I acquired him in at least one league at the trade deadline. So James Conner, definitely the second player on this list as a start of the week. Third is going to be James Cook, another player that you likely are starting no matter what. However, he's got the New England Patriots at home. That's an incredible matchup. Buffalo should destroy the Patriots. I mean, right, this is, we're talking a top 3 team in the league and, one of the bottom, one of those bottom few teams that's fighting for an overall number 1 overall pick type of team. So James Cook, absolute monster this week. I fully expect another huge game. And he had a really good game against Detroit too, which was a bit unexpected, given how good the Lions defense has been against fantasy running backs. But that wasn't the case. We mentioned the injuries, and now James Cook gets to take on the New England Patriots, which I think you're looking at another 20+ points, multiple touchdowns. This has all the makings of a big game, as long as Josh Allen doesn't vulture all of his touchdowns. But I fully expect him to be able to get in at least once, if not twice, again this week. And last but not least, we're going to go a little bit down the list to somebody that wasn't drafted to be further down the list, and that's Travis Etienne, Jacksonville Jaguars running back. And he goes on the road to play at Las Vegas. And Etienne is somebody that, he's had some moments. He's had, a couple nice games here and there, but he's been splitting time with Tank Bigsby, which has been frustrating. And, he's just not been that great this year, especially given how high you had to draft him to your team in a redraft league, but certainly in a dynasty league as well. I mean, unless you do a league where you draft midway through the season, this is a guy that even before this season, this 2024 NFL season was an early round pick at running back. I mean, this is a young player, former first round pick, somebody that had a great season. And I think a lot of people really like Travis Etienne, both dynasty and in redraft, and he's been a massive bust. But this week, I do think that you can play Etienne if you're looking for, a flex play. I think that Etienne against the Raiders, this is a dreadful Vegas Raiders team, and I think that Jacksonville has a very good chance to win this game. The game script should be very positive for Etienne and for Bigsby. I don't think I would start Bigsby under really any circumstances unless you were incredibly desperate. But Etienne, I think if you're looking for a flex play, even a running back too, if you've been hit by injuries, you need a David Montgomery replacement, something like that. I think Etienne can be a solid fill-in and score you some points this week. All right, so moving on over to wide receivers. And again, like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, I actually have 5 names at this position because I cut one from the tight end position. I didn't want to try to dig too far down at tight end and start naming players that, probably not going to be very relevant. And so given the depth at the wide receiver position and that a lot of leagues, you're starting at least, 3, I figured why not throw an extra name in. So starting it off with the player that, of course, it's easy to claim this after he had a monster week. He was the number 1 wide receiver, and that's Davante Adams. I had him written down last week as my number 1 start of the week at wide receiver, and then about 20 minutes before the show, I crossed his name out and put in Tyreek Hill. So that did not work out. Tyreek Hill was dreadful last week. The Miami offense as a whole was terrible, and Davante Adams, of course, went off, and I did not mention that on the show like I should have. So Davante Adams, though, I think he's going to do it again. Now, I don't know if he's going to score 40-plus fantasy points, but I do think he's going to put up very good wide receiver 1 numbers. I think you're looking at another 20-plus point game. He's going up against the LA Rams in New York, and Aaron Rodgers is playing a bit better. As we mentioned, there he's somebody that you can start. Aaron Rodgers actually had a decent fantasy performance, 30 points, depending again on your league scoring format. And Davante Adams, I think, has shown that he is the clear number 1, and I think that this is a defense that they're going to be able to throw on. It was a different situation last week where the Rams were, playing in terrible weather conditions against the 49ers, so I don't expect to see that type of defensive performance again. I do think that, this has a potential to be a pretty high-scoring game. And again, in those situations, in the fantasy playoffs, you're looking at things like the over-under in Vegas and just whether it's going to be a high-scoring game. You're looking at the weather, whether they're playing in a dome or a warm weather climate, things like that. So we've mentioned a few other games that are, outdoors or things like that, like the Lions and the Bears are at Chicago. So that's something where you want to watch the weather. If there's going to be a blizzard or a monsoon or something crazy, you're probably not going to be starting Caleb Williams. I still think you can start, the more obvious names in that matchup, but just something to think about when it comes to, your close calls in terms of who you want to start in the playoffs, where every little thing can matter. So Davante Adams should have good weather, a good situation, high-scoring game, and I like him to repeat as a very effective fantasy option in Week 16. Now, Malik Neighbors is the next player on the list, and he is at Atlanta, an Atlanta team that actually is in the news. 5 minutes before we recorded this show, Atlanta announced that they're going to be making a quarterback change. Kirk Cousins has been sent to the bench, and Michael Penix Jr., the quarterback that was drafted in the first round, top 10 out of Washington and Indiana, he is getting his chance to be the starting quarterback And so he'll be on the opposite side of the field from Malik Neighbors, who was a top 10 pick in his own right. And Neighbors has been awesome this year. He's done it with bad quarterback play, multiple different quarterbacks, and we'll see how things shake out in terms of, this week, who's going to be the starter and everything. I believe last I checked, it looks like it might be DeVito again, but there's Tim Boyle got some snaps. There's so many injuries going on with the Giants quarterback room. It's hard to keep everything straight. But regardless of who it is, I actually feel pretty confident in Malik Neighbors. I think he's absolutely somebody that you can play, that you should be playing. I don't know how in the world I would be able to bench Malik Neighbors. I know that some people, have done it, but I don't know that I have the stomach for that. I think he's been too good, too consistent. He's going to get peppered with targets no matter who's throwing the ball, and I just don't think you can bench that type of talent. I think he's clearly shown that he is, a very high-level wide receiver, certainly a dynasty wide receiver one, a player that's probably going in the, early second round of startups. So I just don't think you can bench Malik Neighbors in this matchup. Atlanta does not have a great defense. They're playing in a dome, and this, even though it's Atlanta, obviously new quarterback, we'll see how that offense looks, but I would expect that Atlanta would be in the lead throughout this game, and the Giants are going to have to throw the ball. So Malik Neighbors is the number 2 receiver on this list. Next up is Jackson Smith-Njigba, Seattle wide receiver. He goes. He actually stays at home against Minnesota. So that's a game that, another big one in terms of playoff position for both teams. Seattle fighting for their division, the wild card. I mean, everything's kind of at play here for Seattle and those teams stacked at the top of the NFC West. And we talked about Minnesota being right there with Detroit. Only 2 losses, trying to both win the division and steal away the 1 seed from Detroit and Philadelphia. So this is a huge game, and I would expect that it's going to be a high-scoring affair. I think that Seattle's going to have to throw the ball, and the reason that I have JSN on this list, because he's been a fairly obvious play the last few weeks, but Geno Smith probably out this week due to injury. That's something to keep an eye on. He did leave the game the other night. So just have to monitor that situation. But regardless of whether it's Sam Howell or Geno Smith, I think that you should absolutely be playing JSN. I would not be benching him because of the quarterback situation. I don't think that Sam Howell is that steep of a downgrade. So I'm still playing JSN. I think you should too. And I think Minnesota is a secondary that you can throw on. And that's what the numbers have said too, that Minnesota is a team that has given up a lot of points, to fantasy wide receivers. So something to keep in mind in that matchup. Next is going to be Courtland Sutton, wide receiver of the Denver Broncos. And this kind of pairs with that Bo Nix play that I mentioned. And, Sutton has been a very solid, steady player over the last month or two. He goes up against the Chargers, who just gave up a ton of points to Mike Evans. And Courtland Sutton, I think, is a similar type of player, more of a deep threat, red zone, big play type of guy. And so I think that is something that Denver can take advantage of. Bo Nix, if he gets back on track like I expect. And so Courtland Sutton makes this list as a start of the week. And last but not least, a player that finally had a big game last week, and that's going to be Devonta Smith. He's at Washington, and just like Courtland Sutton, this is another stack with the quarterback. So I have Jalen Hurts on this list that we mentioned earlier. So Devonta Smith to go with Jalen Hurts, and I think this is going to be a really high-scoring game. That's just kind of how I view the situation, and I think Devonta Smith is going to have to be involved to help the Eagles win this game. So he's battled some injuries. He's been, he's had some disappointing weeks, but I think he finally showed that he's healthy, he's back, ready to go, and he kind of reminded us last week that he is a top receiver in the league, and so I think you can start him with confidence again this week. All right, so touching on the tight end position where They're not a ton of names that like really stand out. There's going to be the obvious few names at the top. Your Brock Bowers, your George Kittle, who've both been incredible this year. The other one that fits into that group, who is my number one start of the week, is Trey McBride, Arizona Cardinals tight end. He goes on the road to Carolina, and Trey McBride has been absolutely dominant. He's been one of the best tight ends in all of football. He's been a big-time success in fantasy, and I fully expect that to continue this week. It's a great matchup. Carolina gives up a lot of points to tight ends, and McBride, absolute slam dunk. He's going to be in your lineup. Nothing else really to say about that. Next up, though, are two names that maybe aren't in your starting lineups that you have to think a bit more about. One in particular. But let's start with the slightly bigger name, and that's going to be Pat Freiermuth, who I also had on this list last week, and he had a solid performance. He did score a touchdown, which is your number one aim typically with tight ends. Unless you're in a tight end premium league like a lot of the leagues I am in, where you're getting that 1.5 per reception at the position, and that can benefit some different players in different ways. But Freiermuth, I think, is going to be able to catch some passes. Certainly another red zone threat. Remains to be seen if George Pickens will play in this game. And, Baltimore's defense is a defense that you can throw on. They've given up a lot of points throughout the season. Now, a lot of that comes with the fact that Baltimore gets these big leads. So we'll see. Pittsburgh, their defense is, going to look to hold them in check a bit. So it might not be as high scoring compared to some weeks. But I still fully expect this to be a situation where Freiermuth is, at worst, the number 2 target in the offense. And, he should get you double-digit points once again. Last but not least is going to be a player that you might have just picked up on waivers, whether it was today or you got him a few days ago, last week when the injury news broke, or earlier in the season when Evan Ingram first got hurt. And that's going to be Brenton Strange, tight end from the Jacksonville Jaguars, who goes on the road at Las Vegas. And Strange had a huge game last week, especially, if you're in a full PPR or, a tight end premium league. I mean, Brenton Strange had a really, really good week. He had double-digit catches and is going to be playing against a Vegas defense, a Vegas team in general that really struggles. And so I think that you can absolutely start Brenton Strange. In fact, I've picked him up in a number of different leagues. I had him on a roster or two already, and I'm going to be starting him. I mean, he had 12 targets, 11 catches, 73 yards receiving. He didn't even score a touchdown, and he still had, depending on your league format, that's a ton of points. In one league I had him, he had 24 points. But again, that's a league that gives an extra bonus for first downs. But still, 20 plus points for a guy that was on waivers a week ago in a number of leagues. That's a lot. And this is something where Mac Jones is probably going to do something similar next week where he's dumping the ball off. It's something where both teams are struggling. But I think Jacksonville can definitely win this game. And that's why I like both Strange and Etienne, who I mentioned earlier. And of course, if you have Brian Thomas Jr., he's one of those automatically in your lineup guys. He's in line for another big week. I didn't include him on the list today, but he's certainly somebody that will be in your lineup. So there you have it. Hopefully, this week's starts of the week. It's late, man. I'm getting tired here, but I got to push this through for you guys. Get some starts of the week out early. I don't want this, to be something that I was sending out on Thursday. So, getting it to you first thing Wednesday morning, and let's just run through the names here one more time before we sign off. At quarterback, Jalen Hurts, Baker Mayfield, Bo Nix, and Caleb Williams. At running back, we have Jahmyr Gibbs, James Conner, James Cook, and Travis Etienne. Wide receiver, we have Devontae Adams, Malik Nabers, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Courtland Sutton, and Devonta Smith. And at tight end, we have Trey McBride, Pat Freiermuth, and Brenton Strange. So there you have it. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate you all listening. Hopefully these will be better. I'm trying to improve on these starts of the week every week. So hopefully these guys can come through, and if you are starting them, if you have them on your teams, hopefully it comes through and leads you to a championship. And that's what we're going to talk about next week on next week's show. Championship week, we'll do some matchups that we like, starts of the week, things of that nature, and just get ready to try to win some titles. So thank you again for listening. This is the Dynasty War Room, and we'll talk to you all next week.